only thing we have to fear is
in war.
fear itself.
There is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Thanks for joining us today. Visit online at wallbuilders.com and also wallbuilderslive.com. It's getting close to the election, and not only are people talking about this at the coffee shops and everywhere else you go, how important these elections are coming up, but hopefully they're talking about it at church. You say, oh, no, church and politics. David, are we supposed to talk about politics in church?
Yes, we are, but not because it's politics. We're supposed to talk about biblical stuff in church, but it turns out that so much that is biblical is also being done by government. And it's not that it's political. It used to belong to the church. It's just that the government doesn't know how to control itself. It doesn't understand limited jurisdictions. It thinks it's supposed to be involved in everything. So it jumps over on all the stuff the church is doing and say, oh, no, that's our stuff. I mean, I cannot tell you, Rick, how ridiculous it has been to watch governments tell churches and tell humanitarian groups, you're not allowed to help the poor. That's our role. You cannot help these people under the bridge. And we have seen government step in time after time trying to shut down charitable opportunities, charitable giving, charitable help, because that's the government's role.
Not just trying to. They've done it. They've actually stopped people from helping those in need.
They have done that. And see, this is the problem. When we say that we're preaching about political things, we're really not. We're preaching about things that have been in the Bible long before government was ever around, American government was ever around. It's just that the American government now says, that's ours, that's ours. It's like 2 or 3 year olds. You know how they fight over stuff? That's my truck, that's my doll, that's what the IRS is doing, is saying, no. Anything that we talk about belongs to us. You're not allowed to deal with it, and you cross the line, and we'll tell you what you can and can't preach about. The good news is that we're at a point in time where that now so much of this is starting to fall around our head that we're seeing a lot of backbone. I have to tell you, recently, over any given year, I will speak to tens of thousands of pastors, literally. I do numbers of pastors' conferences, and over the last probably 18 months or so, I'm seeing a lot more backbone, a lot more pastors willing to stand up and say, I've got to say something. I can't be silent. And I think we're finally getting to the point that we were told to be 2 centuries ago with John Jay. John Jay, our original Chief Justice, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, he said, every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of this country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they're violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. I think we're finally to the point where pastors are willing to assert their rights. They've been told for so long that, look, you don't have the free speech that anybody else has. Now, other nonprofits, unions are nonprofits, and they've got free speech, but you don't have free speech, and we don't monitor what they send out for elections, but we're going to monitor anything you say in the pulpit to see if we think you've crossed the line. And we've been putting up with this, saying, well, we're supposed to be respectful of civil authority. No, you're supposed to do exactly what happened in Acts 4, where the disciples said, hey, we should obey God rather than man. Civil authorities have told us what we can and can't talk about. We're not going to do that because God has told us what we should talk about, and that's the right response. And too many Americans have gotten this thing of, well, you're supposed to submit to government. Well, that's not biblical. You submit to government when it's right, just like children told you submit to your parents in the Lord. If your parents tell you go be a prostitute, you don't submit to that. You do it in the Lord. And so we're finally getting to that point, and Pulpit Freedom Sunday is a great opportunity for us to stand and say, no, we're going to assert our constitutional rights. We in the church, we as pastors, we have a right to free speech. We have a right to freedom of religion. We have a right to express our freedom. We have a right of conscience. We can speak what's on our conscience. Matter of fact, we have a right of association. I can get with everybody inside this building and tell them what I think about any issue at all. I mean, those are all constitutional rights, and it's time for us to start reasserting those rights. Otherwise, we're going to lose them. I mean, it's like use it or lose it, and if we don't start using these rights, we will lose these rights. So Pulpit Freedom Sunday coming up, and no better person I know of to talk about this than someone who has definitely been on the front edge of asserting these rights very boldly, and that's Pastor Jim Garlow out of Skyline Church in California.
Not only asserting them himself, but just great at coaching other pastors on what to do and putting together materials for them. So this is a perfect guy to have on today to talk to pastors about what they can do to be a part of Pulpit Freedom. So stay with us, Pastor Jim Garlow, when we return right here on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently overturned the jury sentence of a man convicted of the brutal murder of a 71-year-old woman because the prosecuting attorney had mentioned a Bible verse in the courtroom. Yet consider what happened in the 1778 case, Respublica versus John Roberts. Thomas McKean, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was the Chief Justice of that court, and addressing John Roberts after the jury had sentenced him to death for treason, McKean told him, "You will probably have but a short time to live. Before you launch into eternity, it behooves you to repent of your evil deeds, to be incessant in prayers to the great and merciful God to forgive your manifold transgressions and sins, to teach you to rely upon the merit and passion of a dear Redeemer." This prominent founding father actually delivered a salvation message to the defendant in the courtroom.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live. Thanks for staying with us. Our good friend, Dr. Jim Garlow. Pastor, how are you, brother? Thanks for coming on.
Doing great, my friend.
Hey, it's another exciting year of Pulpit Freedom Sunday. I remember when you took this thing over a couple years back, it just exploded to thousands of pastors. So excited to see so many pastors stepping up in the pulpit and saying, hey, I have a religious freedom and a freedom of speech to be able to speak to these issues. Do you think we'll get even more this year?
Oh, I sure do. There's a fresh momentum, and there's a fresh momentum in a new way. Not only are pastors speaking up and participating in Pulpit Freedom Sunday, and those who want to can cross the line and challenge the Johnson Amendment as they choose. But there's another dimension to it. We're asking Christian leaders and pastors across America to sign up at pulpitfreedom.org, just saying, I want the Johnson Amendment repealed. We think we potentially could be within maybe legislative striking distance of at least getting it gutted, if not, in fact, repealed.
Wow.
And so we're going forward aggressively, believing that this anti-constitutional, anti-First Amendment law has been on the books for 60 years, muzzling and silencing and intimidating pastors and creating even a cultural myth in the minds of many parishioners and church attenders that this law, this unconstitutional law, could actually be gutted or potentially repealed.
Now, Jim, what was the website you mentioned that folks could go to?
Pulpitfreedom.org. And we'd ask every pastor to sign up and every Christian leader. If you're a leader of a ministry of some kind, go there and say, I am in favor of repealing the Johnson Amendment.
Tell us a little bit more about the background on that.
On July the 2nd, 1954, then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, before he was president, returned to Washington, D.C., very upset with two businessmen who had opposed him in the election because they felt he was soft on communism, and they did it through not-for-profit corporations. He was very upset and angry at them, wanted to put a stop to them, so the Senate was in an overhaul of the tax code at that point, and he stepped before the Senate and added what became known as the Johnson Amendment. It was a voice vote only with no discussion, and it went through. And what it did, and this gets a little techie, the IRS has 29 different categories of what is called 501c organizations. That means not-for-profit corporations. There's 29 categories, but it only silenced those in the 501c3 category, one out of the 29. All churches fall in that category. The chief of staff, the legislative aide for Lyndon Baines Johnson at the time, acknowledged we didn't have churches in mind at all. We never intended to tamper with that because churches always had freedom of speech, First Amendment rights, no governmental intrusion in the pulpit at all. But the IRS jumped on that, seized the moment, and started muzzling and silencing and cut off 160 years of pulpit freedom in America and started saying, well, first of all, you can't endorse or oppose a candidate. Well, We're not saying a pastor should or should not. We're saying a pastor should say whatever he wants to under the authority of God. That's up to him. But then the IRS couldn't even delineate for sure what represents endorsing or opposing a candidate. It was very vague for a season. And the result is a cultural myth developed that a pastor should not speak on anything so-called political, when in reality all these so-called political issues, many of them are moral, biblical, ethical. They're all theological and biblical issues we should be speaking to, but pastors were silenced, backed away, were intimidated, and then people in the congregation bought into this 60-year-old cultural myth, and they too said, now, Pastor, don't you speak on those issues. So now we have 60 years worth of pastoral silence where the biblical commentary on community and national life has been void, and that's why America is in the situation it is. So people need to go to pulpitfreedom.org, get their pastor to sign up to preach a biblical election sermon on October the 5th in solidarity with several thousands of pastors across America the same day. And then any Christian leader who's the head of a Christian organization, go there and sign up, say, I want the Johnson Amendment to be repealed.
The website is great, Dr. Garlow. I was just pulling it up as you were talking, and I mean, it's got a timeline. I wish I could describe, maybe I can try to describe this to folks, but a great timeline picture so that you can see what happened here from the time of the Revolution all the way to 1954. America's churches and pulpits were free. Johnson Amendment kicks in 1954. IRS controls the pulpits for 60 years, and now we have a chance to change that going into the future. Looks like you guys even have a video and a document for the history on the Johnson Amendment, so pastors can get educated on that, and as you said, sign up and help to get it repealed, so that long term other pastors do not experience this muzzle that has actually it's a fake muzzle, I guess. It's kind of a paper tiger, but if you believe that muzzle's there and you silence yourself, then it's just as real as it would be if it had constitutional teeth.
That's so true, and they can go there on that site, pulpitfreedom.org, and that video you just spoke of is a 4-minute video by an attorney named Eric Stanley, and it articulates very clearly the history of the Johnson Amendment, very easy to understand so everybody can get informed what happened. And here's what's interesting, Rick. If a church gets contacted by the IRS and says, your pastor went too far in his sermon, so now we have the sermon police, the IRS of all things, the IRS that can't even hang on to their own emails, that goes after any so-called right-wing organization, they're now sermon police, and they notify a church, you went too far in that sermon. Now, if a pastor says, oh, we're sorry, then sometimes they'll just back up, and that'll be the end of it. But if a church will lawyer up because they know their rights, their constitutional rights, the First Amendment, this is a violation of the First Amendment. If that church will lawyer up, and there's 2,300 attorneys allied together in the Alliance Defending Freedom that are willing to defend any pastor for his sermon pulpit freedom for free, pro bono. And if a church will lawyer up, in the cases where that's happened, the IRS has backed away and they dropped the case after a couple years because it has never been taken to court. We want it to go to court for the purpose of proving that this law is unconstitutional. And we've never made it to court because the IRS drops the case anytime that happens.
It's got to happen, and the more pastors that get involved, the more likely that it will. We got to take a quick break. Our guest, Pastor Jim Garlow, the website, if you want to know more, pulpitfreedom.org. Stay with us right here on WallBuilders Live.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The key to a self-governing nation is self-governing people, and the key to personal self-government is to live by the standards in God's Word. If someone cannot control himself by those standards, then our Constitution certainly will be unable to restrain him. Understanding this, John Adams declared, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." Greed, ambition, revenge, or seduction would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams believed that successful government rested not upon our great Constitution, but rather upon moral and religious people.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. Our guest today is Dr. Jim Garlow, pastor Skyline out in California, and also helping with Pulpit Freedom, the Pulpit Freedom Initiative, which has pastors all across the country standing up and speaking truth from the pulpit and standing together to say to the IRS, you cannot muzzle our pastors. It's October 5th, right, whenever the Pulpit Freedom is going to be?
It's October 5th or any Sunday between now and the election, preferably October 5th, so we stand in solidarity the same Sunday. Now, in the past, we as pastors would intentionally violate the Johnson Amendment because it's unbiblical and it's unconstitutional. And we would mail our sermons into the IRS. So far, the IRS has received about 2,000 sermons. So somebody's getting saved there by this time. Awful lot of great sermons at the IRS. But we're not, this year, particular year, we're asking pastors, if they want to cross and violate the Johnson Amendment, go ahead. If they don't want to, that's up to them. They can determine what they want to say in their sermon. We have a lot of sermon helps at pulpitfreedom.org. There's a lot of helps in how to preach on biblical issues as it relates to our community and national life. In addition, a tremendous amount of information about the Johnson Amendment itself. What's kind of fascinating, Rick, is October 5th is the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement from University of California, Berkeley, where the riots took place October the 5th, 1964. And there's even a marker on Sproul Plaza there on the UC Berkeley campus marking where the free speech movement began. And now here we are. This is the 60th anniversary of taking away free speech from pastors, the 50th anniversary when the broader culture got it back, and it happens to fall on the same day, the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement. We as pastors are standing up and saying, no, we want free speech too. We want no governmental intrusion into the pulpit at all.
I love it. I love it. Pulpitfreedom.org. That's the website. Lots of great helps, as you were saying, for pastors to have there. Everyone can go there and get that information. Send it to your pastor and encourage them. Let them know there are people in the congregation that want the church to stand up for free speech and for freedom of religion. Dr. Garlow, when you began, well, you've always spoke on these kind of things, but I mean, you pastor a very large church there in California. How do people respond when you speak to this? I mean, it seems to me people are hungry for this, but what do they say to you? Do they say, hey, we don't want politics in the pulpit, or do they say, hey, it's about time somebody applied Scripture to my daily lives?
Well, those who don't understand Scripture don't like it. I mean, there's always going to be a few in every church. Now, I've been very blessed. I'm in a church that gets it. But there's some in some churches that have left various places. There's places people who have left this church, and they don't understand the biblical principle on this. Let me show you what's happened. If I would have said 50 years ago the ripping of a baby in the womb is a bad thing, people say, well, of course it is. Say it today, oh, Pastor, you're being too political. But I said 30 years ago that the practice of homosexuality is not scripturally acceptable. They said, well, of course. Say it today. Now, Pastor, you're being too political. If I would have said marriage is a man and a woman 10 years ago, well, of course. Say it today. Now you're being too political. In other words, what the enemy has orchestrated is getting what we used to call biblical, moral, theological, ethical issues that we'd preach on. Now the enemy has got it so we label it political, so it will silence pastors on it. But here's the good news. When we do our after Pulpit Freedom conference calls where we ask all the pastors to come on and report what happened, they tell us over and over the people broke out into applause. I remember one pastor one year saying the people broke out into applause so much that I couldn't even get through all the material I planned to that day because there was so much applause. It was standing ovations. Now, there's going to be a few who are going to write you an email and say, we're out of here if you're going to be this way. But the fact is that the overwhelming majority of people who are tuned to the issues of Christ and biblical truth, they say, thank you, Pastor. And we had lots of pastors who were told, we wish you'd preach like this every Sunday. They loved it. They were hungry for that kind of candor, honesty, and prophetic teaching.
Well, we need more of it all across the country. Pulpitfreedom.org is the website, all the tools right there. Pastor Garlow, thank you so much for continuing this fight, for setting a great example, and for helping to train so many other pastors across the country. I love the theme on the website there, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is IRS approved. That's what they would love to have. You only can do what's IRS approved on Sunday morning. We got to stop that. We got to get it back to rendering unto God what is God's. Appreciate your time today, sir.
Hey, thank you, my brother. Good being on with you.
That's Pastor Jim Garlow. Back in a moment with David Barton. Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution, but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty in Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our founding fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Thanks to Pastor Jim Garlow for coming on today and for the incredible work he's done to help explode pulpit freedom around the country. So many new pastors because of his work in doing that. And, David, I love the way that he laid it out and talked about the tools that are available, but also just gave the history. We always talk about the biblical and historical perspective on things. Man, he gave us some great historical perspective and biblical perspective.
He gave great historical perspective, and I was really shocked at several things I heard. I tell you, I couldn't believe some of the things he said. I mean, can you imagine a politician getting angry because he got criticized? Can you believe LBJ would do that? And that because he got criticized, he would want to show up and take away their right of free speech, that he'll show them that a politician would retaliate against a political enemy? I don't think I've ever seen that before. That's just hard for me to imagine. And yet,
unfortunately, in such a way now that it's impacted us generations later.
Yeah. Well, see, and that's part of the problem. We're now being bound by a policy that came from a spirit of revenge. And that's a bad way to make policy. So here we are 60 years later being bound by someone who wanted personal revenge. And, you know, it's quite possible that what happened with that criticism was exactly correct in that criticism. You know, maybe LBJ had been soft on communism. Maybe that criticism is what got him to get a backbone and stand up some. Who knows? But nonetheless, to persecute people because they said something that offended you, sorry, not the way they were. And the other thing he said I couldn't believe was that the IRS took more ground than was given them, that LBJ didn't have churches in mind when he did that, but that the IRS took that ground anyway.
Shocking that bureaucrats would grab at power? Really?
Yeah, I could. That's just hard for me to imagine that the government would take more power than what was given it. I don't quite understand. All right, I'm being facetious.
And
everybody
if we don't push back, they keep that power.
They keep the power, and that is the problem. They will take every bit of ground they get, and they will not cede it back. And that's where you have to assert your rights. You can't just defend. You have to assert. You have to go in the offense and take that ground back. And so I love the fact that Jim was pointing out that we're really now within striking distance of gutting the Johnson Amendment, to be able to gut that amendment. And that's what ADF has been trying to do for a number of years. They want to get it in court because they get it in court, they can win on constitutional grounds, which is why the IRS won't come after any of these churches because they don't want it in court. They would rather have 370,000 pastors think you can't say something than to get it in court and get their ears pinned back and everybody find out, hey, IRS has got no control over churches or what's said in the pulpit. So that's really good news that not only do we have the litigation side going on, but we have the legislative side going on, and that we're getting within striking distance doing something legislative. That's wonderful.
Well, and that would, I mean, you talk about a massive change. When you look at virtually every cultural issue that we're dealing with right now and why we've lost ground, you've got to, as Charles Finney said in that quote that you use, I mean, you lay it at the feet of the pulpit. And if you can reinvigorate the pulpit and once again let them realize that they do have the freedom to do this. I mean, right now the ones that are courageous enough are doing it. But once you win that battle at the court level or you get the IRS to finally back off and they all realize they can do it, wow, man, you talk about big changes.
Well, you know, you mentioned something there that reminded me of something that Jim said because, you know, you were talking about how Jim stands up for this, and Jim said, yeah, I've been blessed with a really good church on this issue because he does preach really pointed sermons. No, that's an understatement. He's not blessed with a good church on that issue. He's trained a good church on that issue. He's done this along the way, and they have learned that, you know, that's what the Bible does say. He showed me exactly where that is in the Bible, Hey, he's right. I may not like that. I may disagree with it, but he showed me where it is in the Bible. And so over the years, Jim has trained his church on all sorts of cutting-edge issues because he keeps going back to the Bible, which is why it's not a political issue. Now, his sermons, the IRS would say they're political sermons. They're not. They're biblical sermons. And he said, the ones who get offended are the ones who don't know the Scriptures. Now, think about that for a minute, because what that means is so many churches are letting people who don't know the Scriptures drive what happens inside that church. They get offended, and because they get offended, we won't talk about it. No, they get offended because they don't know the Scriptures. And so you're going to let someone who doesn't know the Scriptures drive what happens inside a church that's supposed to be built on the Scriptures? How logical is that? And so to be driven by the critics, to be driven by the criticism, if that had been Jesus's mantra, we wouldn't have the gospel, and he would not have gone to the cross, because there's way too much criticism he got that he had to ignore all along the way. And I'm constantly reminded, going back to what he did with his own disciples in John 6, he said, well, are you guys going to leave me too? Everybody else is offended. They've all turned away. And they said, Master, those were really hard sayings you gave them. He said, hey, that's the truth. And then the same thing came up in Matthew 15, and they said, Jesus, don't you know that they were offended at what you said? And Jesus sums up, says, look, they're going to get it now or in eternity. They're going to have to get used to the truth at some point. I'm not going to back off from the truth. And so that kind of mentality is the example that Christ set. And we can't let those who are offended because they don't know the Scriptures dictate what we will and won't say out of the pulpit. So pastors really do need to get a backbone. The history's there. The Bible is there. The Constitution's there. Pulpit Freedom Sunday. Use it. Use it or lose it.
All the tools are there at pulpitfreedom.org. Check it out today. We'll have a link to make it easy for you at wallbuilderslive.com. Thank you for listening to WallBuilders Live.
We stand undivided forever.